I still remember the exact moment. I knew everything was about to fall apart, but let me back up and give you some context first, because you need to understand just how deep this rabbit hole goes. My name is Marcus, and for the past 7 years, I've been the senior AWS cloud infrastructure engineer at a mid-sized fintech company called Meridian Processing Solutions. We handle payment processing for about 300 regional banks across the Midwest, which means on any given day, we're pushing through roughly $40 million in transactions. When I say I built our cloud infrastructure from the ground up, I mean that literally. I was employee number 12, hired back when we were operating out of a converted warehouse with folding tables for desks and a dream of disrupting the legacy payment processing giants. Our founder, David Chen, had worked at one of the big banks and saw how desperately the smaller regional institutions needed affordable, modern payment rails. He brought me on specifically because I had just left a position at a major cloud consulting firm where I'd spent 4 years designing fault-tolerant architectures for Fortune 500 companies. David wanted someone who could build infrastructure that would scale from handling a few thousand transactions a day to millions. And that's exactly what I did. Over the years, I architected a multi-region AWS deployment spanning 3 availability zones with automated failover, implemented a custom Kubernetes orchestration layer that could spin up additional processing nodes within seconds during peak load times, and designed a disaster recovery protocol that had a recovery point objective of under 15 seconds. I'm not telling you this to brag. I'm telling you this because you need to understand that our infrastructure wasn't something you could just figure out by watching a few YouTube tutorials. Every single component was custom, built to meet the specific compliance requirements of PCI DSS Level 1 certification, which is the highest security standard in the payment processing industry. Our CloudFormation templates alone represented over 8,000 hours of development and refinement. The Lambda functions that handled our real-time fraud detection were processing events through a custom machine learning pipeline that I had integrated with SageMaker endpoints, and the whole thing was monitored through a Grafana dashboard ecosystem that I had personally configured to alert on over 200 different metrics when something went wrong at 3 in the morning. And in this industry, something always goes wrong at 3 in the morning. I was the one who got the call. I was the one who knew that if the P99 latency on our primary API gateway crossed the 200 millisecond threshold, we needed to immediately check the RDS connection pool before the whole thing cascaded into a complete service outage. For 7 years, I maintained a 99.97% uptime record. That translated to roughly 26 minutes of unplanned downtime per year, which in payment processing is almost unheard of. The industry average hovers around 99.9%, and some of our competitors were lucky to hit 99.5%. David used to joke that I was worth my weight in gold, and given that I was pulling in about $175,000 a year plus equity, I'd say he was getting a bargain. But then David sold the company 18 months ago to a private equity firm called Harrington Capital Partners. And that's when everything started to change. The first 6 months under new ownership were fine. The PE firm brought in a few of their people to handle the transition, but they left the technical teams alone. We kept doing our jobs, the transactions kept flowing, and the banks kept paying their monthly fees. But then Harrington started doing what private equity firms always do. They started looking for ways to cut costs and boost margins, so they could flip the company in 3 to 5 years for a tidy profit. That's when they brought in Victoria Ashworth. Victoria had an MBA from a top 20 program, 3 years of management consulting experience at one of the big firms, and absolutely zero technical background whatsoever. She walked into her first all-hands meeting wearing a blazer that probably cost more than my monthly car payment, and introduced herself as the new Vice President of Operational Excellence. I should have known right then that we were in trouble, because in my experience, anyone with the words operational excellence in their title is really just there to fire people. Victoria spent her first month conducting what she called a comprehensive operational audit, which mostly consisted of her walking around with a clipboard asking people what they did all day, and then looking confused at the answers. She sat in on one of my architecture review meetings, where I was explaining to the junior engineers why we needed to implement connection draining on our load balancers before doing a blue-green deployment, and I watched her eyes glaze over about 30 seconds in. She didn't ask a single question, just made notes on her tablet, and nodded occasionally. The first real confrontation came about 6 weeks into her tenure. She called me into a conference room for what she described as a strategic alignment discussion. I walked in to find her sitting at the head of the table with a laptop open and a presentation already queued up on the wall screen. "Marcus," she said, gesturing to a chair like she was granting me an audience. "I've been reviewing the budget allocations for the technology department, and I have some concerns I'd like to discuss." I sat down and waited, already feeling the knot forming in my stomach. "I see here that your compensation package represents nearly 12% of the total IT budget," she continued, clicking to a slide that had my salary highlighted in red like some kind of accusation. "Additionally, we're spending over $400,000 annually on AWS services, which seems excessive for a company of our size." I took a breath before responding, because I knew that whatever I said next was going to set the tone for every interaction we had going forward. "Victoria, I appreciate you taking the time to review our costs, but I think there might be some context missing here. Our AWS spend is actually quite lean considering the volume of transactions we process and the compliance requirements we have to meet. If you compare us to similar payment processors on a per-transaction basis, we're running about 15% under industry average." She smiled the kind of smile that people give you when they think you're being naive. "I understand that you believe the current setup is optimal, Marcus. That's natural. We all have a tendency to defend our own work, but I've been brought in specifically to find efficiencies, and I've already identified several opportunities for improvement." She clicked to the next slide, and I felt my blood pressure spike. The slide was titled, "Cloud Infrastructure Optimization Strategy," and featured a logo I didn't recognize next to the words, "Offshore Technology Partners." "I've been in discussions with a consulting firm that specializes in cloud cost reduction," Victoria explained. "They've assured me they can reduce our AWS spend by 60% within 90 days while maintaining full functionality. Additionally, they can provide ongoing infrastructure management at a fraction of our current internal costs." I stared at the slide for a long moment, trying to process what I was hearing. "Victoria," I said slowly, "our infrastructure handles PCI, compliant payment processing. You can't just hand that off to the lowest bidder. There are audit requirements, security protocols, compliance certifications. The people managing this system need to have specific credentials and undergo background checks. They need to understand our custom architecture, which took me years to build and document." She waved her hand dismissively. "I've discussed those concerns with the vendor, and they've assured me they can meet all compliance requirements. They have teams that work with financial services clients all the time. And frankly, Marcus, I'm concerned that there might be some empire building happening here. You've made yourself indispensable, which is a red flag from an operational continuity standpoint." I almost laughed out loud at the irony. She was simultaneously accusing me of being a single point of failure and proposing to replace me with an unknown offshore vendor. "Can I ask what company you're considering?" I said, keeping my voice as neutral as possible, "and whether they have any references from PCI Level 1 certified payment processors." Victoria's smile tightened slightly. "The company is called CloudFirst Solutions, and they come highly recommended by Harrington's operational team. They've done similar work for several portfolio companies. I pulled out my phone and did a quick search right there in front of her. Cloud First Solutions had a website that, like, it had been built with a free template, a LinkedIn presence showing they'd been founded about 18 months ago, and exactly 0 case studies involving financial services. Their team page showed about a dozen people, mostly with generic headshots, and not a single one listed any AWS certifications or PCI experience. Victoria, I said, trying one more time, I really need you to understand what you're proposing here. Our infrastructure processes payment data for 300 banks. If something goes wrong, we're not just talking about a website going down. We're talking about millions of dollars in failed transactions, potential regulatory fines, and legal liability that could bankrupt the company. I'm not trying to protect my job here. I'm trying to protect Meridian. She closed her laptop with a decisive click. I appreciate your input, Marcus, but this decision has already been made at the executive level. CloudFirst will begin their onboarding process next Monday. Your role during the transition will be to provide knowledge transfer and documentation. We expect the handoff to be complete within 30 days. She stood up, clearly considering the meeting over. I hope you'll approach this transition with professionalism and a collaborative spirit. I walked out of that conference room feeling like I'd just been told the Titanic was unsinkable. For the next week, I did exactly what Victoria asked. I was professional. I was collaborative. I documented everything with the kind of meticulous detail that would make a court reporter jealous. Every single runbook, every architecture diagram, every custom script I'd written over 7 years got transferred into a comprehensive knowledge base that ran over 400 pages. I recorded video walkthroughs of our deployment processes, our monitoring systems, our incident response protocols. I created flowcharts showing exactly how our Lambda functions interacted with our DynamoDB tables, how our API gateway routes mapped to our backend services, how our CloudWatch alarms cascaded through our PagerDuty integration. I gave them everything they could possibly need to succeed, and I made sure every single piece of documentation was time-stamped and version controlled in our Git repository, so there would be a permanent record of exactly what I had provided. The CloudFirst team showed up on Monday as promised. There were 3 of them, all connecting remotely from what appeared to be a shared office space, somewhere with very poor lighting and a constant background noise of other conversations. Their senior architect was a guy named Rajesh who seemed pleasant enough, but whose questions revealed within the first hour that he had maybe 6 months of actual AWS experience. He asked me what an availability zone was. He asked me why we had multiple subnets. When I started explaining our VPC peering configuration, he just nodded along with the kind of blank expression that told me he was going to Google every word I said the moment the call ended. His 2 junior team members didn't ask any questions at all. They just sat there with their cameras off, occasionally unmuting to confirm they were still on the call. I spent 2 weeks conducting knowledge transfer sessions that felt like trying to teach calculus to someone who hadn't learned arithmetic yet. Every time I explained one concept, I had to back up and explain 3 prerequisite concepts first. When I showed them our Terraform modules, Rajesh asked why we weren't just using the AWS console to make changes manually. When I explained that infrastructure as code was essential for maintaining consistency and audit trails in a PCI environment, he nodded and said, "Yes, very good," in a way that made it clear he had no intention of actually using Terraform. I documented every single one of these interactions, every question they asked, every concept they struggled with, every warning I gave about critical systems that required careful handling. I sent daily summary emails to Victoria with my concerns, written in the most diplomatic corporate language I could muster, noting that the CloudFirst team was still developing familiarity with our specialized architecture, and that I had some concerns about timeline feasibility given the complexity of the knowledge transfer. Victoria never responded to a single one of those emails. On day 28, the 30-day transition period, Victoria called me into her office and informed me that my position was being eliminated effective immediately. She handed me a severance agreement that included a clause requiring me to be available for reasonable consultation for 60 days following my departure, at no additional compensation, of course. I signed it because the severance was 4 months of salary, and I had a mortgage to pay. She had security escort me out of the building with a cardboard box of personal belongings like I was some kind of criminal. 7 years of building something I was genuinely proud of, and I walked out the door, carrying a coffee mug, a framed photo, and a stress ball shaped like a cloud that one of my junior engineers had given me as a joke. I spent the first 2 weeks of unemployment applying to jobs and trying not to think about what was happening back at Meridian. I got a few calls for initial screenings, lined up some interviews, started feeling cautiously optimistic about my prospects. The market for experienced AWS architects was still strong, and my track record spoke for itself. I figured Meridian would muddle along somehow. Maybe they'd have some incidents, learn some hard lessons, eventually hire someone competent to clean up the mess. I certainly didn't wish disaster on them. There were good people still working there, engineers I'd hired and mentored, folks who had nothing to do with Victoria's cost-cutting crusade. But on day 19 of my unemployment, at exactly 20:47 in the morning, my phone started blowing up. The first text was from my former junior engineer, David Park, and it just said, "Holy crap, are you seeing this?" The second was from another former colleague, asking if I knew what was happening. The third was from a number I didn't recognize, that turned out to be someone from Meridian's customer service team, who had gotten my contact info from somewhere, and was desperately asking if I could help. I opened Twitter and searched for Meridian Processing Solutions, and my stomach dropped. The first tweet was from a credit union in Ohio saying they hadn't been able to process any transactions for over an hour. The second was from a community bank in Indiana, reporting the same thing. Within minutes, I was watching a real-time cascade of financial institutions across the Midwest discovering that their payment processing was completely dead. I learned the full story later, pieced together from conversations with former colleagues and the incident post-mortem that eventually leaked to the press. Here's what happened. The CloudFirst team had been given access to our production AWS environment on day 1 of their onboarding, which was a decision I had explicitly argued against in one of my many ignored emails to Victoria. Rajesh had apparently decided that our AWS costs were too high because we were over-provisioned, which was his interpretation of the fact that we maintained standby capacity to handle traffic spikes and failover scenarios, without consulting anyone, without testing in a staging environment, without so much as a change management ticket. He had logged into the AWS console at around 1:30 in the morning and started manually terminating what he considered to be excess EC2 instances. The first instances he killed were our standby database replicas. These weren't actually excess. They were the warm standby nodes that our automated failover system would promote to primary if our main database ever went down. We kept them running because spinning up a new RDS instance from scratch takes time, and in payment processing, time is literally money. When Rajesh terminated them, nothing immediately broke, which probably gave him false confidence to continue. The second thing he terminated was what he thought was a redundant Kubernetes node pool. What he actually terminated was the node pool running our message queue consumers, the services responsible for pulling transactions off our Kinesis streams and writing them to the database. The moment those pods disappeared, transactions started piling up in the queue with nothing to process them. Now, under normal circumstances, our auto-scaling would have detected the missing pods and spun up replacements. But Rajesh had apparently been optimizing our auto scaling configurations the previous week, and in doing so had accidentally changed the minimum replica count for the consumer service from 6 to 0. He'd also modified the scaling triggers in a way that prevented new pods from launching unless CPU utilization exceeded a threshold that could never be met by pods that didn't exist. So the consumers were dead, the auto scaling was broken, and transactions were backing up at a rate of about 2,000 per second. The first alert started firing at 1:47 a.m. Our CloudWatch alarms detected that the Kinesis Stream consumer lag had exceeded 10,000 records, and sent notifications to PagerDuty, which then attempted to notify the on-call engineer. But here's the thing. I had been the on-call engineer for 7 years. When I was terminated, Victoria had assured me that CloudFirst would be taking over on-call responsibilities, but apparently nobody had actually configured PagerDuty to route alerts to them. The notifications went to my old Meridian email address, which had been deactivated, and to my old Meridian phone number, which had been reassigned to a sales rep who had no idea what a Kinesis consumer lag alert meant. By the time anyone at CloudFirst actually noticed something was wrong, the consumer lag had grown to over 3 million records, and the entire processing pipeline was effectively frozen. Rajesh's response to discovering the outage was, by all accounts, panic followed by poor decision-making. He attempted to manually restart the consumer services, but couldn't figure out how to deploy them, because he had never actually learned how to use our Terraform modules. He tried to spin up new EC2 instances manually but put them in the wrong subnet, so they couldn't communicate with the database. He attempted to restore the terminated instances from snapshots, but selected snapshots from 3 months ago that had completely different configurations. Every single thing he tried made the situation worse. By 20:30 a.m., he had somehow managed to corrupt the state file for our Terraform configuration, meaning that even if someone competent had been available, they would have had to spend hours reconciling the actual infrastructure state with what Terraform thought existed. At 3:15 a.m., Rajesh made the decision that would turn a serious incident into a complete catastrophe. Convinced that the database was somehow corrupted, he initiated a failover to our disaster recovery region. Under normal circumstances, this would have been handled by our automated failover system, which knew how to gracefully redirect traffic, update DNS records, and ensure data consistency before cutting over. But remember, those standby replicas Rajesh had terminated. They were gone. And the automated failover system was designed to promote a standby to primary, not to spin up an entirely new database from scratch. So when Rajesh manually triggered the failover, the system attempted to promote a replica that no longer existed, failed, and then marked the primary database as unavailable as a safety precaution. We now had no working database in either region. The bank started calling Meridian's support line at around 3:30 a.m. By 4:00 a.m., there were over 200 calls in the queue and a hold time exceeding 90 minutes. By 5:00 a.m., local news stations were picking up the story as customers across the Midwest woke up to discover they couldn't use their debit cards. By 6:00 a.m., Meridian's CEO was on an emergency call with the board of directors. Victoria was nowhere to be found, and someone had finally thought to call me.